now start our featured program for today, the last one of the season. And I want to say that this program that you're about to experience is going to be divided into 4 parts, featuring highlights only. It goes back 400 years. If I were to detail all of that, we would be here a very, very long time. So what I'm going to do is dwell on the different sections that I found the most interesting because they have visible reminders of the Old Common and things that I was able to find through my research. So I'm going to go ahead and move with that, and then at the end you'll have a chance to ask any questions, and we'll be happy to try to answer those. I'd like to once again thank Karen for her research and organizing. We did get a couple donations of documents from a professor who's out in the Midwest. He's retired. He sent us a box full of documents from his study of Horace Cleveland. So Karen's been spending, what, about a year? And she goes through and she reads all the letters and categorizes them and puts them into a form where they can be retrieved for future research. Because as you'll see, Horace was born here, but not so well recognized as he was out in the Midwest. So, okay, let's see, what else have we got? I want to thank also the partners, the Thayer Memorial Library, for allowing us in here on a day when they're not usually open. Joe Mollet was very gracious to allow this. And also Freedom's Way, which is the heritage corridor for our area, which comprises 45 towns, central Massachusetts and a little bit to the east. And they were sponsoring us as well and advertising for us on their website. Yes, Karen.
I'd just like to say that Thayer Memorial Library every May celebrates Lancaster History Month. So this is part of Lancaster History Month, but also there are more programs coming up. So be sure to check their website because you'll find them interesting too, I'm sure.
Okay, and I think I'd like the lights down, switch lady. Okay. All right, so this is the Lancaster's Old Common. As I said, I'm going to divide it into 4 parts. The very earliest days, the days of the Salem colony, a Lancaster Industrial School for Girls period of time, and then we're going to dwell on native son Horace Cleveland. Okay. This is a map. It's a little hard to read and find detail. I did have some trouble finding a good map, but this shows the Connecticut path and the Bay Path. Now, in the earliest days of New England settlement, there was a lot of fur trade between the natives and the English people who had come in to settle the land. And in order to do that, they had to get those different furs and other products back and forth from the coast to the interior. And there were 2 ways to do this. You could go either the southern path, which is the Connecticut path, and then the Bay Path, which is overland over the Worcester Plateau and down towards Springfield. So you can see the star on the far right is the Boston area where the trail would start. And up on the top of the screen, there's another red star, which is Lancaster, near Lancaster, because Lancaster was always mentioned as one of the important stops along this one particular Bay Path trail. And there are several sub-trails to the Bay Path, depending on where you're starting and where you're ending, but basically that's it. And then you would end up in Springfield, finally after going through maybe the Brookfields or some other areas that are further to our west. And then if you were interested in getting to the Connecticut River through the southern part, you'd go on the southern trail and end up down in Hartford. And the attraction is the Connecticut River. Oh my. When I found out the Connecticut River was there, it was very exciting because that river is manageable. You can really navigate that river and get goods up and down the river. Unlike the rivers that traverse central Massachusetts, can't quite do it on the Nashua so much. The direction isn't as good for navigation. So the land is fertile out in the Connecticut River Valley, so that was a big destination, and Lancaster was definitely on that trail. How do you get there? Well, as you come over through Bolton, you come over Wattaquatic Hill Range, and you see the old Bay Road, And you see in the far distance Wachusett, and we all live in the region of the Wachusett, as it was called. And here's a map, finally, just to give you a little orientation on the Old Common itself. You can see on the left-hand side, the meeting of the waters, and you can see the pathway across the Old Common on the bottom there. And by 1879, Marvin had it pretty well delineated as to who was living where and such, because this was after the industrial school for girls. So to give you some orientation, if you had time, you could look through and he would tell you exactly where each one of those little numbers belonged and who lived where when in Marvin's book. In the beginning days, the land was populated with garrison houses for defense against the Native Americans. The Wilders, at one time, there were lots and lots of people who had the last name of Wilder. And they had a garrison house that was located 20 rods or 110 yards in back of the Safford House, and you'll probably all recognize the Safford House because it's still there, not in very good condition. And so that was one of those early garrison houses that the people would go to for safety purposes. And then there was also a fortified house, which became the farmhouse of Richard J. Cleveland, who we will mention later on. It was originally occupied by the first Judge Wilder. And the place was called Bride Cake Plain, after our first two meeting houses were burned by the natives, which were down in the South Lancaster area. They moved the center of town across the river to east of the river, so for safety reasons, and they called it Bride Cake Plain. There's a new generation of settlers. We don't know exactly who first used the term bride cake, but it was a new area, and from 1704 on, for at least about 50 years, it was a center of town, thriving center of town activity. Third meeting house was up there. The second burial ground, the Old Common, was taverns, mercantile establishments, as well as farms. So that was the center of town. There's the meeting house. We don't know exactly what it looked like because there are no existing pictures to this day, but if you drive up the hill, past the 4 or 5 corners, you can look, and it was on the south side of the road, east of the Nashua, and on the south side of the road. And then it was enlarged a few years later, and the minister, Reverend John Prentice, spent most of his pastorate pastoring in this church. And then, after the church was enlarged, a committee of 9 men were chosen to seat the house. This was done according to your rank, based on your family name, your property, your office as a member or whatever, office of members. Okay, so if you were a judge perhaps or a leading member of the town, you'd get a better seat in the church. It is said that the resultant jealousies and heartburns lasted through succeeding generations. Oh my. And Mrs. Prentice, of course, the pastor's wife, got a very good seat. She got to sit right there next to her husband up in the pulpit. And this is only just a recreation of what they looked like. I wish we'd had pictures. So about 1743, then they moved the meeting house and they moved a new one to Lancaster Center, which is kind of going up the hill after you cross the Sprague-Vose Bridge, heading toward the town center as it is today. So that was the move of the church, and then the things kind of died down a little bit on the Old Common. There's the cemetery, final resting place for settlers, Fairbanks, Houghtons, Sawyers, Whitings, Wilders, Willards, so many more. And there's the stone. It mentions on his stone that he was the donor for the land, Thomas Wilder. And there is a picture that I took from a book written by Marion Safford. She wrote a book about colonial Lancaster, 1937. And across the street, you can see this, the tombstones in the foreground, and across the street there aren't any houses. You can see there's kind of an elevation of land, and that was a training field. Now the training field is a flat common area east of the meeting house and on the south side of the road, and the town records indicate that they established this in 1718. And this was something that every town in New England would have in Massachusetts per the court. They wanted to have anybody from men from 60 to 60 were called out for training days, and the training days might be 3 to 6 a year, and you would be called in for military drilling and exercises, and this would be like a first line of defense for the town in which you lived in case of an emergency. Of course, they weren't always solemn affairs. The training day could turn into an entertaining day too, where people would gather and have a good time and visit with their neighbors. So this is a training field up there in the old common. I don't know exactly which houses have that in their backyard. They may or may not be aware, the people who live there today. And then we have taverns. Of course, in New England, the tavern is a tradition in general, right from the very earliest days, and it was a way for the general court to control the dispersion of alcoholic beverages. So you had to get a license to do this. So you'd have ordinaries or licensed houses. And of course, being on the Bay Path, with all that traffic going back and forth, you would have to have a tavern. And besides that, if the mail was coming through, there would always be a group of people gathered at the tavern because they'd want to catch the local news, or they'd want to catch the gossip or whatever else was going on at the time. So they could play games, enjoy entertainment, receive gossip and news at the tavern. And here, the local tavern, the Whiting Tavern it was, and there were several tavern keepers according to Tahanto, which is Henry Stedman Nurse's pseudonym. When he wrote, he used the name Tahanto quite frequently. So this is the local tavern. And the horses also, if you were in a rush to get somewhere, or maybe even not so much a rush, your horses would be pulling the stage, and they would get exhausted after about 15 or 16 miles. So you'd have to stop and change out your horses as well. So the taverns were many. And this is the site of the Whiting Tavern. Timothy Sr. and Jr. were the longest of the tavern keepers there during that period of time. And of course, that building is long gone, but this house has been built on the site in 1850, and so it's an easy landmark. If you want to point out where the earliest tavern was up on the old common, that's where it would be. Lancaster at one time had as many as 5 taverns. We know the location for many of them already. Some are still standing. One is still standing anyway, that I can think of at the moment. Okay, and we've got then some houses that you're going to recognize. This is the Thomas Safford House, which still stands. Doesn't look like that now. First occupied by Thomas and his wife Elizabeth about 1790. Had 10 children, 7 of whom did not survive. And according to Marvin, he was a respectable man, but he was subject to fits of mental aberration. And his death in the book, in the Vital Records book, says suicide, which is a very unfortunate thing. So he was one of the first occupants of this particular house. And then came another gentleman who was buried in the old common cemetery, and he's one of the only ones that has an iron fencing around the edge of his grave, and it's a pretty fancy gravestone. He was a man who had been educated in Europe, a Scottish man, David Stewart Robertson, not very long lived. I think he lived to be about, 30 years old, and only lived in America for a short time, but he enjoyed the old common, and he was known as kind of an eccentric person also, known for liking to take groups of young people for picnics. One of the few things he liked to do, I guess, and to entertain or amuse himself. Okay, and then good rest, our Pauline Revere Thayer, who married into our Thayer family, became a philanthropist, and about 1889, she used this same building for a vacation place for working girls from the city. And at the end of World War II, or I, it was used for soldiers recovering from the Spanish flu. So she's the great-granddaughter of Paul Revere, and very much into the idea of giving back. And I just threw this in, I don't know a lot about the schoolhouse or who the school teachers were, but I know that at one time this is the way Lancaster educated their young people. They had the schoolhouses in all different areas of the town. And this was at the same time that the Lancaster Industrial School for Girls was established. And later on, after it was closed down about 1870, it was turned into a residential house, and you can see this couple there, and there, I think it's a Hupmobile. Correct me if I'm wrong, is that a Hupmobile? I don't know. But anyway, an antique car. And we do have a lot of these old schoolhouses that were rehabbed and made into houses for people to live in. I know my mother had lived in one up on Fort Devens back in the days before they were taken down by the government. And there was one on Neck Road that was recently burned out. In the front of that particular house that burned was the old schoolhouse. So we lost one of them. But anyway, that's what the old schoolhouses were all about up on the common. Then we have the Abner Pollard House, which you probably recognize. It's in beautiful shape there. It's believed that Abner and his wife Ashka, hard to know how to say that. They were the first occupants. They got married about 1790, had 7 children. She passed away. I think he may have married again, not sure, would require more research. But they're the ones who originally put up that Greek revival looking structure. And then of course years later it was occupied by Horace King, Horace or Captain Horace King. And I thought first, well, he was a sea captain. Must be he was part of the Salem group. No, he wasn't part of the Salem group. He was actually from Brewster. And then how did he get to the Old Common? Well, then I did a little more research and I found out his second wife was originally from Bolton. So that's probably why he ended up at the Old Common. And of course, he was a man of wealth and consequence. This must have been taken from his obituary. Public esteem and public spirit. So that was Horace King. And then we have the Oliver Carter House, 1750. Oliver Carter, and there were lots and lots of Carters. The lady Joy Peach, who used to do the genealogy for me, would just kind of shake her head when I would ask her about a Carter. Which one? And they all had the same first names, and they'd name their children. If one died, they would get the same name again. And, cousins and uncles and aunts all had the same name. But anyway, this was originally Oliver Carter's house, and I'll talk more about him. Oliver Carter's wife was the granddaughter of the Reverend Timothy Harrington. Okay, and later this place was used as a store by a man named Moses Emerson, who I believe is buried in the Old Common. Interesting, he had 4 wives in his lifetime. Not that long a lifetime, but many wives in that lifetime. And then in 1820, it was purchased by William Shaler as a residence for his widowed sister, whose name was Abigail Stillwell, and her children. And then later it was the industrial school for girls because they wanted a farmhouse. Okay, and here is Carter and Andrews in Lancaster, across from the post office in the center. And this is where Oliver Carter's sons were at work. And they were printers and engravers and illustrators and bookbinders. And the one who was the longest lived was Timothy Harrington Carter, who was named after his grandfather, Timothy Harrington. And that he went to Boston. His brothers published the things in Lancaster, and he sold them at the Old Corner bookstore in Boston, Massachusetts. He went in there. He didn't build that building, but he remodeled it and made it into a bookstore. So that's a connection we have with the Carter family in Boston. Okay, another nice, just kind of a pastoral view of Old Common Road. This one was taken by our librarian, who's Alice Green Chandler. When she wasn't busy doing library work, or after she retired from such, she took up a camera and went around town and took some beautiful pictures. So you can see the cemetery on the right and no houses there, just open space on the left-hand side of the road heading down toward the 5 Corners. And here's a house I have yet to research. I don't know much more about it except for what it says up there at the top. I found this advertisement. If anyone knows anything about it, please inform me right now or later on. Well, who had it? Who built it? Apparently you could go camping there. They sold gas and oil and accessories. You can get chicken, dinner. So another little place there on the Old Common that has yet to be researched.
Heather,
Yes.
I do know one person who lived there.
Who?
My husband's family
Yeah.
were Goslins.
Goslins?
Goslin. And
Oh,
they
good.
lived there.
Okay.
And Peter spent, when he was little, more than a few nights there.
Yeah.
To stay there while his
Okay.
father worked.
All right. Well, we'll have to fill out the records because I didn't have that in my research material that was available. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Salem colony, another period of time in the old common history. Okay, so we've got this house. You're going to see this house many times. Lancaster was considered a salubrious location. If you came out to Lancaster, you could take in the air and you wouldn't die. You would be healthy. I'm exaggerating, but it was a location known for the good air and good for your health to get out into the country. And the house was first started by Caleb Wilder, 1776. He never finished it. A man who was in the English baronial style, Lord Cairns, got a hold of the house and he finished it, and then he also included a deer park. Now that's common in the English countryside over in England, in the old country, and a lot of times, you know, you'd have a fenced area where the deer could go and they could get in, but sometimes they couldn't get back out, which is, I don't know, maybe they hunted them, or I don't know why they wouldn't let them back out, but they didn't. Okay, so then in 1804, it became the property of Major Joseph Hiller from Salem. And here's the beginning of the Salem colony. Okay, now Joseph Hiller, who was this man? There he is on the left. During the American Revolution, he was made a major in the Massachusetts militia. He was well known to General Washington. Washington thought a great deal of him. He knew him and esteemed him, and he appointed him the first collector at Salem and Beverly, a position which he held until January of 1803, which is about the time his wife died. And Joseph Hiller was a silversmith, a jeweler, watch and clock maker, and an engraver. And you can see the two on the left, Lady Washington and George Washington, are attributed to Joseph Hiller. There's some controversy about who really did the engravings. And then the ones on the other side are John Hancock. And I guess Joseph Hiller gave different colors to his costumes, because you could do that as an engraver. And those are definitely attributable to him after a painting by John Singleton Copley. So that was the work he did. And he also did this, and this is kind of fun because I found this in the Thayer Memorial Library. Hiller had a beautifully cut agate seal, head of Washington, which he sent to England for at a cost of 40 pounds. Now, on the one side, on the left, is his letter seal, J.H. Hiller, Joseph Hiller. On the other side is the head of George Washington, hard to see because it's wax, I guess, a wax seal. And that piece of jewelry in the middle is just something I found on the internet to illustrate what you might do with an agate. You could make it into a piece of jewelry and then have a head engraved or imprinted on it. So this is what he did. And those things are right here in our library. So I thought that was kind of special. And here are the two sea captains that came to live in Lancaster, the the Cleveland brothers, who married their first cousins, who were sisters, and they came out and lived with their father-in-law, Joseph Hiller, and for many years had kind of a glowing lifestyle out here. And as sea captains, their fortunes would come and go. So this would be during the good years, and then there were the bad years when they'd lose their fortunes, or there would be an accident at sea and all the money would be gone. But anyway, these are the two men who occupied that house that I showed. Okay, and this is the wife, Dorcas Hiller Cleveland. She was married to Geoffrey Cleveland, who had previously been on the left side. And she started a Latin grammar school in Lancaster. And she was very educated and very cultured and interested in ideas. And so she started her Lancaster Latin Grammar School. And when the men would graduate from Harvard, they'd come out and spend a season to be an instructor in the school. So she has a man named George Emerson, who started a school in Boston. I can't go into all their histories because we don't have enough time. But Warren Colburn was a mathematician. Jared Sparks was a Harvard president. And James G. Carter was a competitor for being the father of public school education. However, Horace Mann kind of beat him out, and James Carter didn't get the credit that he probably deserved. So this is what Mrs. Cleveland was doing, and of course her son, Horace, and his brother went to the school. And at the estate in the evenings, they would have these grand symposia. In a symposia, you have a meal, and after the meal, you have drinks, and you sit around and you talk. And you don't just do idle talk. You do talk about the philosopher Rousseau and his ideas about man and education, and Pestalozzi as well. And they were also described as avidly Unitarian and well connected with the intellectual elite of the time. So this is what they were doing up there. Yes?
It's a tradition of symposium.
Yes, yes, I'd love to hear more about that. And want to offer any more right now? No? Not later. Another program, maybe. Okay, so we'll move forward. And of course, transcendentalism came into it because transcendentalism and Unitarianism are very closely related, as from the study that I've done. Philosophy that emphasizes the inherent goodness of people and nature, and the purity of the individual, and self-reliance and independent, people who are independent. So they're closely aligned, and we could do a whole talk on just the ideas that these people were interested in for another day. And of course, Elizabeth Peabody and her family, the Peabodys, came out during this period of time. Now, their stay in Lancaster was only maybe 2 years, 18 months to 2 years. But Elizabeth and her mother had an idea that they were going to make a school for young ladies. And so Elizabeth went up to the symposia in the evenings, and she participated, and she visited with Dr. Fair, who took her under his wing, from what I understand. And she went there and enjoyed it very much and was influenced by it. But they didn't stay long. Their father was a dentist. I guess he didn't have enough patients in the area, enough clients in the area, but they moved on. And one thing I want to say, Mrs. Cleveland and Elizabeth got along for the most part, and Elizabeth admired her. But at one point, and this stuck in Elizabeth's mind for years, all her life, Mrs. Cleveland called her out and criticized her in public. We don't know what that was all about, but it stuck with Elizabeth forever. She didn't like that. Had a negative influence, I guess. And there's the boarding school. There's the advertisement for the boarding school, Mrs. Peabody and her daughter. And Elizabeth's students in that first and only term she had, half a dozen daughters of the farmers and traders of Lancaster, as well as her 5 siblings. So that was a school that she and her mother operated together, and but it was short-lived. And so she moved on. She went on to become I think she went up to Maine next, and her sisters went to different places as well before they settled. And there they are. Elizabeth remained single all her life, and then eventually married Horace Mann, and Sophia married Nathaniel Hawthorne. So they're well known to all of us, but they had their brief stay in Lancaster. And if you read Megan Marshall's book, they loved Lancaster. The girls were teenagers, and I think Sophia was only 11, but it stuck with them all their lives, the beauty of the countryside. They enjoyed it. And okay, now we're going to talk about William Shaler, very talented and capable individual. He was a good friend of Captain Richard Cleveland. They had been all over the world. There's an entire book about their travels all over the world in the ships and different ports in Hawaii, in South America, Algeria, all over the place. And William Shaler was an interesting individual, and he also bought the first Carter dwelling up on the old common that I had pictured before, that was to become the farmhouse at the old, at the Lancaster Industrial School. And then he bought that for his sister, whose name was Madam Stillwell, and her children. Now, Shaler himself was a bachelor, but he was in charge of taking care of his widowed sister's children. Said he also bailed out Richard Cleveland a few times when Richard Cleveland lost his fortune. So in 1929, Shaler on the left, and he's on the right too, those are both pictures of Shaler, went to Cuba, and in order to keep his good friend Richard Cleveland in a job, he took Richard Cleveland with him to be the vice consul. So then there was an epidemic, and he died in 1833. But his sister, Madame Stilwell, continued to live on in the he then bought the Cleveland house itself, and she became the lady who lived in the Stilwell mansion, which was first the Cleveland mansion. She moved out of the farmhouse and into the Stilwell mansion. So can you put the lights on for a second? I want to just read, because it was so good. Okay, he's well remembered, and I wanted to read what Horace Cleveland said about him, Shaler. He says, "Of all men whom I ever met, not excepting Daniel Webster, I think Mr. Shaler had the most imposing presence, to which the term kingly would be most truly applicable. He was over 6 feet in height and of large frame, but with no tendency to corpulency. His gray eye had a very marked and peculiar expression of stern resolution, which no one cared to encounter in opposition, and his whole demeanor and movement was dignified and majestic. I remember hearing Mr. Nathaniel Chandler describe, with the peculiar humor of which he was the master, the effect of Mr. Shaler's appearance upon the crowd who were waiting for the assortment of mail at the Lancaster post office. They opened to the right and to the left, said he, and shrunk out of his way as they would have done if a lion had walked in at the door." That's the imposing impression. And I want to read, while I've got the light on, Mrs. Abigail Stilwell, Shaler Stilwell, who was his sister, who stayed living on the old common past his death and raised all those orphan children. Mrs. Stilwell came from New York, having 4 children of her own and 4 adopted orphan children of a brother lost at sea. In the words of a great nephew, only one of that generation, the sister Abigail Stilwell, lived to my day. Her brother, William, had established her in a rather stately place in Lancaster, Massachusetts, with her children and the 4 left by his brother, the privateer captain. So this woman had to raise all those children by herself. Thereto I went in 1855, when I was just 14 years old, in the company of my father on his first visit to his childhood home after an absence of a quarter century. My great aunt was then a venerable woman, over 80 years of age, and a singular dignity. It may well be said, splendor of shape and manner. She was 6 feet in height, perfectly erect, clad in black silk, capped with a white tall turban, and armed with a gold snuff box, to which she much resorted. I have seen several great dames of the Virginia stamp, and have beheld them since in many lands, but none of them compared with that woman. I recall even now the fear of her, which even her greatest kindness in no wise cleared away. She belonged to a variety apparently now extinct, in which the sense of personal dignity and authority shaped the life. It is characteristic of this woman that she was found dead, sitting upright in her chair with her snuff box in her hand. And he says, I remember that I was curiously interested in my father, whom I had never seen awed by anyone. And he was visibly cowed at the presence of his aunt. He seemed indeed almost as much in fear of her as I was myself. Now, the father was an MD, and the 14-year-old lad later grew up and had a Harvard education and became a paleontologist. So these were, educated, smart people, but they were very, but they were very much in awe of this woman, and there she is. Okay, so she became the lady of the manor. I have no picture of her. That's just something I pulled off the internet. Tall and erect, and this was about 1855 when they went to see this woman, and she died probably just a few years later, and meanwhile the state was purchasing the property for the house that is there in the background again. Okay, then after 1825, the glory of the old common had departed. The Clevelands were gone, they went to Cuba, and that was about the end of it there. So she was kind of a holdover, but I believe she was well known. Madam Stillwell, everybody must have known her. And there's some reminders of the past. If you go up to the old common cemetery, you will see that we've got Joseph Hiller, his daughter Mary, and a grandson buried there. And on the left, you see the stones upright. In 2021, we had a pine tree come down, and the pine tree didn't destroy the stone. It was the DPW tractor that went in to clean the pine tree out. Now that has since been taken off the ground, and hopefully we can get that stone restored. But that's why I kind of have a war against overgrown trees, because every time we have a windstorm, something bad happens. But that's our reminder. Lancaster Industrial School for Girls, and we'll whiz through this one quickly. Lancaster, groundbreaking facility, was the country's first state reform school for girls, created as an alternative from the common practice of imprisoning juvenile delinquents. It was one of the most progressive correctional institutions for women of its day. Okay, now the Fay Commission, they were the people who had to draw this school up, the plan for the school. They had to select a location, they had to prepare estimates of the buildings and plans and organization and system of government. And the man who did this mostly was Francis Ball Fay. And the place was inaugurated in 1856. And there were a lot of things happening in the 19th century that would cause a need for this type of school. There was immigration, urbanization, industrialization, women having to work in the factories and coming in off the farms, and subsequent poverty because the families couldn't afford to keep their children. So what they do is they complain that their child was unruly, and then they would have to be turned over to the state. And before that, they'd be thrown in prison. What kind of a future would that be for a child? And so the 19th century people were very interested in saving the girls from this type of fate. And that's Francis Ball Fay. He's the only one of the trustees who actually moved to Lancaster, as far as I know, and stayed for many years. And he lived on the corner of East George Hill Road and Main Street, across from what was the Atlantic Union College Boys Dormitory. Karen.
I would just like to say that if you go up into the library and the balcony, you're going to see a beautiful marble clock, which was a gift from Francis Fay. I think he donated $100 for the clock, and it still works. I think a librarian winds it every week, and it still works. So when you're up there, be sure you check out that beautiful marble clock.
Yes, okay. And that house, when Fay died, he died in 1876. And one of the Thayer, third generation of Lancaster Thayers, Eugene Van Rensselaer Thayer, bought the property, loved the elm trees, but had the house removed. So that house went on a ox cart, huge ox cart, but somehow got moved up to Heritage Lane on George Hill in Lancaster. Now that's quite a feat, because that looks like a large house. And then E.V.R. Thayer built what was today called the White House, which is still there on the site. And if you look at it fast, it looks like it's the same place, but it's not. So anyway, just a little piece of extra history. Okay. And here are the original buildings, the three that I keep referring back to that are the kind of the anchor buildings. And the one, of course, at the top has been demolished because it caught fire. Okay, and then as soon as they established, they used the Stillwell Mansion for the main building, and then they put up a couple of cottages right away in 1855, and these first two brick cottages were named for trustees, and most of them are named for trustees. And on either side at equal distance from the Stillwell Mansion, and the cottages the idea was to have a surrogate family for the girls. The girls were originally aged 7 to 16, Accommodations in each were the same. You'd have a parlor, a workroom, a library, schoolroom, kitchen, laundry, bathing room, second floor. And this is a picture I took when the commission made a tour of the buildings. They let us in to see what they were like about 2021. And that's what they look like. These are the beautiful rooms for the girls. And they each had an individual room, which is a luxury for a girl who comes from nothing. This is the way it was. And the attic, of course, was for a playroom or a sewing room or whatever. And that's one of the rooms that I was able to get a picture of. Majority of the sleeping rooms are small, for one person only, provided with a bureau, a chair, and a single bed. And they locked the doors at night. The girls were locked in, but the rooms were well ventilated because they did have windows in each room, which is nice. I don't know how many of them tried to crawl out the windows. You know, if you're in prison, you feel like you want to get out. Okay, another piece of the architecture up there, the white church, and it's shown in the middle of this slide, was the move from the campus to be the church in 1858. It had formerly been the meeting place of the Universalist Society that was down in South Lancaster, very near where the Sunoco station is in South Lancaster, that location. Okay, and here's a view of the campus someone had done back in 1860. You can see, I think the Stillwell Mansion is kind of in the middle there. Sadly, in 1877, the Stillwell Mansion, housing 30 girls at a time, was burned to the ground by 2 inmates, according to the Clinton paper. And they added another chapel. There's a couple different views of this. I guess this is more a non-denominational chapel for the girls through the years. And we'll go through and take a look at some of these other views. These are just postcard views. There's the administration building, one of the cottages. And they're building the campus, 1860, 1870. This is a fancy cottage, the Clara Barton Honor Cottage. And you can see on the right that it has kind of a tower stairwell in the back, a fancier building than the others. I don't know what you'd have to do to get in there to have that rather than the other cottages. And then we have a school they put up in about 1875, and a hospital, 1900, and Mrs. Thayer's building, back again. She passed away in 1934, and it was acquired by the Lancaster Industrial School for Girls, beautifully restored, and became the residence of the school's superintendent. And then after the school closed, went to the state of Massachusetts, used for various purposes, and there it is as it looks now. Okay. And here's the Putnam Cottage. I don't know the year for that one. Campbell Cottage, I think the Campbell's the last one put in. And the cemetery. And cemetery is known to be the burial place for maybe 6 to 12 girls. They did start to excavate at one point. They didn't know where the cemetery was, which surprises me because it was clearly marked on an 1898 map. But they put the stones underground for some reason, the headstones, and they decided to just leave them that way. I guess it protects them from vandalism, and just build a fence around it. So there are some girls, but the newspaper articles that I've read, it's not clear how many or what their names were. Okay, we have the commissary on the building, the tool barn with a power stack. Barns, these barns are looking in this view much better than they do today. The roofs are falling in and they're ready to, be demolished, I think. And here's one that's kind of different. It's no longer standing. It was standing in 1898 on the map, but has a different kind of style, and I don't know the story behind that one. And then we have the administrative building in a picture, and the girls out on the grounds in their white attire, tending to the flower beds. And a view, this is looking down toward 110. If you look off in the distance, you can see the mountain. I don't know whether that's Monadnock or Wachusett, but it's a beautiful view down that way because it's high on that plain. And if the trees aren't there, you really get a fantastic view. Okay, so there's the map. The cemetery is marked in there toward the center, that little cemetery that I just pointed out. And it shows all the locations that were there at that time.
Heather?
Yes.
May I speak, please?
Certainly.
Ginny and I are graduates of Lancaster High School,
Yes.
and one of our classmates was from the industrial school.
Yes.
We don't know to this day why
Yes.
Two men brought her every morning, and the same two men brought her back to the school. She excelled. She was a wonderful, wonderful girl. She basically stayed to herself, and I have a beautiful picture of her in my yearbook. And she became a lawyer in Washington.
Well, see, you never know what the future holds. And I just wanted to show these too. I found these online. These are promotional materials. On the left, it says classification. When the girls would come in, they would be, at the beginning, it was age 7 to 16. And then later, they were just taking teenagers and no more single-digit little girls. But anyway, they would classify them according to their moral character, which would be frightening. I don't know if you get away. Anyway, and then they showed, they have outdoor play, work and play. They get released on probation and get out into the world. And if they were good, maybe they'd get better treatment when they came back, or maybe get released earlier. And then their afterlives, they like to give a story about this one actually married and has a fine family. And the father-in-law says they're getting along splendidly. So they wanted to put a really good spin on the future of what these girls were able to accomplish after their release. And there's some pictures once again. You've got the cottage, you've got the girls at recreation. The farm was a big part of it because in the city you don't get to experience farm life. And then of course on the bottom of the ironing room you get to learn your housewifely skills. The expectation was that many of them would become housewives or housekeepers, domestics, and that was a really good thing if you could land that kind of a situation. Okay, now was the school a success? This book on the left-hand side tells the story of the first 50 years. It was mixed. She said, statistically, it seems that most of them were successful in their later lives, but the idea of surrounding them in a pastoral environment in Lancaster didn't always hold true. And so you have this idea of hereditarianism. What makes a difference in a person's life? Is it the environment or is it your heredity? And that's a debate that you could have on and on and on. Any more to add to that, Karen? You did.
It was, at the time, social Darwinism
Yeah,
was
Darwin.
just so popular that different people looked at these girls in different ways and treated them differently. And it was sad.
Yeah, but who knows?
Heather?
Yes.
We do have some pictures of some of the girls they took part in the plays, in the scenarios in 1912.
Oh, in the pageant.
In the pageant.
Lancaster pageant,
Yeah.
which is nice, yeah.
They were some of the extras, and it shows them.
In the white dresses and dancing.
And they were in other things as well.
Well, that's
Other
good.
costumes.
They tried to give them a well-rounded experience and make up for their lack of family. Yes, Joan.
Yeah, back in '61, I was in a square dance group that did demonstrations all around the areas. And we were asked, the caller was asked to come, and we danced with the girls up at the school.
Oh, wow.
And we were four couples.
Uh-huh.
All the girls wanted to dance with the guys. It was really funny. They were like fighting with each other about who was going to get to. But the sad thing is, there's always, the good is what you want to look to. But the sad thing is, when I was in the office years ago, there was a girl called, and she said that her great aunt had been an inmate, and she died of cancer, and she was part of an experiment when they were putting radiation in the milk and giving it to the gals to see how it would affect the people. And that happened in this country a lot. Yep.
Use them
And
for
they-
experimentation.
In prisons and different areas of children, people who had no rights.
Yep.
So
Yeah, about
there's
that.
good about stuff like this, but there's also
Yeah.
scary stuff. And if you remember, who was Tom Moore's wife?
Tom
Morris.
Morris. Annette Morris.
Annette, she worked as one of the counselors up there till it was closed.
Uh-huh.
And I think she wrote a little bit about that in her little story that she has in the file.
Oh, yeah. So,
But
yeah,
anyway,
it's an interesting chapter in our history,
and
for
we have
sure.
a lot of the furniture because when they broke the
Yeah.
place up,
Uh-huh.
Phyllis Farnsworth was able to get
Yeah.
the things
Let me
they
just,
had.
say this now. We got the furniture. If you come up and visit the office in the Prescott
And
building
all
where
the
I
records
sit,
are in
with the
Boston.
commission office, the furniture there is nice furniture, and a lot of it came from there, along with some dishes and some other, things. But it's interesting because my predecessor, Phyllis Farnsworth, on the commission, worked so hard to get all these places in Lancaster on the National Register and the districts on the register. And this happened right when the school closed down. It got on the register, and this is her map from her helper. Her name was Janice Breen. And then it went downhill because they don't do any harm to the buildings necessarily. They just let them sit.
Yeah.
And when they sit, they fall apart all on their own.
Metropolitan Hospital is similarly
Yeah.
neglected.
And then after that, we have the Children's Action Corps, Robert Kennedy, which is campus split. And most of their activity takes place on the west side of the campus. And they have a 99-year lease, which started, I think, in 2005 or 6. And then they, built this up and put some new buildings in for their purposes. And then on the other side, the houses that had formerly housed the girls became a pre-release center. MCI, Massachusetts Correctional Institution, opened in '75. And this report from 1993 shows that it was at 184% of capacity, almost twice the size, twice the volume of people pre-release. And what is it going to happen now? Well, we went to a town meeting in Lancaster last Wednesday. This issue came up about having the property transferred back to the town of Lancaster from the state of Massachusetts. And of course, there are a lot of details to be worked out in that regard, but let's hope that it will be for the best, because that is a great facility. It has a lot of possibility. When we went through, I have an architect, Mark Scriver, who went through with us, and he said these buildings have good bones to them. They're good, solidly built buildings. It would be a shame to see them all demolished or whatever. Anyway, okay, last part. I'm going to whiz through here. Pioneer landscape architect, born in Lancaster, 1814. The man who hated rectangles. And this is true. All right. I'm going to start with a timeline of his life. On the left-hand side, we have his life in the east. On the right-hand side, we have his life in the west. And he's a man who really only came into his true profession in his mid-years, which is mostly when he was in the Midwest. He did do a little bit when he was on the East Coast, but we'll follow that through. So he was born in Lancaster, moved to Cuba, returned to the States, became a scientific farmer, married his wife, and lived in New Jersey for a while, returned to Massachusetts, living in Salem and Danvers. Then he went out to the Midwest, to Chicago, Minneapolis, and died in Hinsdale, Illinois. Had many other projects in Nebraska, Wisconsin, all over. And we're going to follow his life here. Horace's early days. Now, I said on the left-hand side, he was in his mother's school and absorbed like a sponge all of her ideas about nature and incorporating it into your life and loving it and appreciating it. And that stayed with him all his life. And then on the other side, after her school closed down on the far right, they put a new school in on the Lancaster Town Common, about where the Prescott building is now, approximately today. And then, of course, we have our iconic Bullfinch First Church of Christ, Unitarian. And the story is from the early days. I just have to share this in case you haven't heard it before. When he was about 16 years old, so the story goes through one version, he and his classmates were now going to school in the building on the Common. And it was lunchtime, and they had an hour-long lunch. And they had to go back, and one of them said, "Oh, we better get back down to go to class," because they were up in the tower. They were allowed somehow to go up in the bell tower. So he says, "Well, let me check and see what time it is." So he's up in the tower, and some of you have heard this story before. So he leans over, and all of a sudden, whatever it was he was hanging on to gave way, and he lost his balance, and he thought, well, if I can only fall in that intermediate place, I'll survive. And that's probably the last thought he had for the moment. So he fell, and it was like 58 feet to the ground, but when he got midway, it didn't stop him. He kept going down, and there was another structure on the ground, like a pump or a well, some boards or something there for a well, and he hit that, and he bounced up. And then he was like unconscious, and they brought him, his classmates, of course, were horrified, and they came right over, and he was carried over to the tavern, which I think had to be where the center post office is now. That would be the closest tavern location. And he was revived, but he didn't remember anything about it. He said, this is only what was told to me in my later on years. So he survived a near-death experience early in life.
Heather?
Yes.
Was Mrs. Cleveland, how old was he at the time compared to Elizabeth Peabody?
Okay, Horace is a little bit younger than the Peabody sisters.
I wonder if she was influencing Elizabeth. And
I don't know, this accident.
It was a mischief.
Yeah, I don't know, but I will move on from there. Okay, I said the Clevelands and the Peabodys crossed paths a lot. I said that the Clevelands lost their fortune, but Mr. Shaler got the father, Jeffrey Cleveland, a job in Cuba. So the whole family moved down there, and it so happens that Sophia had headaches all her life, and they thought if they sent her to Cuba that she might recuperate, that the weather would be good. So she and Mary, her sister, were sent down to a coffee plantation in Cuba, and Doris Cleveland, of course, was there, and as soon as she found out the girls were down there, she said, you girls better be careful. Don't go out at night unaccompanied, or they're going to think you're a loose woman, you know, because you just don't go out unaccompanied. She was, Hiller Cleveland was a little bit of a busybody, it seems like. But anyway, she was warning the girls. And Mary was a governess, and they stayed. And Horace was with the family, but he must have come back to the States before his family did. So they interchanged there. And Mary also saw firsthand some of the slavery on the coffee plantation in Cuba, and that affected her later life. She was an abolitionist. Okay, then the Clevelands moved back to the States, Horace Cleveland did, and Horace lived in New Jersey for a while, and then when he came back to the States, they went up to Salem, and they moved into a house that had, of all things, been previously occupied by Sophia and Nathaniel Hawthorne. So they crossed paths once again. They must have known each other all through the years. And then Horace finally moved into a house in Danvers where he stayed for several years during his midlife, and he was already in his 40s, and he began to really think about landscape architecture as a profession. And so like his friend and colleague, Frederick Law Olmsted, he'd been a farmer. As a matter of fact, they even displayed some of their horticultural produce in the same horticultural fairs. And he began thinking about landscape architecture as a profession, as did Olmsted. And some of Cleveland's first projects in Massachusetts, here we have Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, which is beautifully laid out in a non-rectangular way, of course. Ralph Waldo Emerson was there. He was a trustee on the committee, and he said, you've got to follow these certain principles. And of course, Horace was in complete agreement with his plan, I'm sure. Well, maybe not complete, but in agreement. So these are some of the projects that he did in the 1850s. Cemeteries in Massachusetts, Sleepy Hollow, Oak Grove in Gloucester, Mount Feake in Waltham, Wyoming in Melrose, Mount Prospect in Bridgewater, and Milton Cemetery in Milton, Mass. 4 of them are already on the National Register. And he and Copeland worked together, but then they went their separate ways, and Copeland actually died at the age of 44, so they didn't work together anymore. But when Horace went to the Midwest, he moved there, he wrote a book called Landscape Architecture as Applied to the Wants of the West. And this book really got a lot of attention. And he had studied the landscape in the western part or midwestern part of the country, and he saw how different it was, and he worked to try to apply his principles to the landscape such as it was out there. Okay, so these are some of his projects. He had Juneau Park, for example, in Milwaukee, and they're countless. I mean, there's hundreds of them. Powderhorn Lake. I think that's an artificial island. Minnehaha Falls in Minneapolis, Minnesota. This was made famous by Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha. And this is a plan that never materialized, but you can see he was very excited about it. He knew Daniel Chester French, who's the sculptor who did the Lincoln Memorial, you know, the statue of Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C. He says, "I'm running wild over the photo of Dan French's Longfellow Memorial, which I received yesterday. He wrote me that he thought it's the best thing he's ever done, and those of his friends who had seen it agreed with him." And there's Longfellow, and I guess that was to be installed at Minnehaha Falls, but somehow it never happened. So,
French is buried in Sleepy Hollow.
yeah, in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, because he was a student of Alcott's,
Right.
yeah, Louisa May Alcott's youngest sister, May, I think. Amy. Okay, so this is one of his greatest achievements in the Midwest, the Minneapolis parks and parkways. And there's a pathway in the Grand Rounds in Minneapolis, and he's getting all these accolades in the Midwest. But then back on the East Coast, we have felt that he deserves more credit for his East Coast projects. He did Roger Williams Park, 1878, which is a beautiful place down in Rhode Island, Providence. He did Natural Bridge. He did the walkways around Natural Bridge in Lexington, Virginia. He did Jekyll Island, which is off the coast of Georgia, the little bit of coast that Georgia has, in 1886. And he had some really good trees to work with there. I mean, I love those trees. I've been there personally many times, and he had them planted all over the place because he was hired by the millionaires to create the landscape for the Millionaires Club. So these list of millionaires that are on the right, J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt, Marshall Field, Rockefeller, brother of John D., John Jacob Astor, Andrew Carnegie, Goodyear, and Richard Crane, which is the one from the Crane Estate up in North Shore here in Massachusetts. That's the plan for their getaway. They had what they called cottages, not as elaborate as the ones of the Newport cottages, but they had cottages in this little historic area. And so he worked with them to establish a beautiful setting for that. And there is a room that was up on the top there is their clubhouse. And you can see there the door, it says Federal Reserve. And just a little tidbit of information. It was in this room that in 1910, a group of elite businessmen, some of the ones probably from the page before, gathered secretly to solve the economic crisis of the nation. And together they created the first draft of what would become the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Reserve Bank. These private millionaires were going to bail out the government. Well, how is it now? Oh my. Okay, we're going to return to Lancaster. You can tell I'm closing in here. I know I'm long, but how often do I get to do this? Not much. Okay, so we're returning to Lancaster. This was dedicated in 1876. He had long finished his cemetery projects and just came back for this one particular one in his hometown. And if you look at this, it's very typically Cleveland. When you go in, you see the roads, and they're extending like the fingers on a hand. There's 5 different roads going in all directions, not just a rectangular cemetery with straight rows. And you go in and you see more of these connecting roadways, and he used his design principles, naturalness, connections, town-country continuum, which I'll show you in a minute, need for recreation. He wanted it to be a place of recreation where you'd go on a Sunday afternoon and walk or drive your carriage through or have a picnic with your family. It was to be a recreational area. So he wanted movement from light and dark, beautiful views and vistas, creating a continuous sense of mystery. Okay, so we've got that. And here's a plan, perhaps drawn by Cleveland, of the cemetery on the left, or maybe his son Ralph helped him with it. No rectangles, all the design in many different amorphous kind of shapes there. And then as somebody flew over it in the 60s, and then they did an enhancement of what it might have looked like if it had been foliated. So there's a look of it from the air. And it said, the research I found said, in designing Eastwood, Cleveland emulated the form of a city. A dense, heavily designated center of the 46-acre cemetery was connected by a parkway to a forested area where burials took place here and there among the trees to resemble the rural periphery of a community. So we've got a diagram, and this is the way it was to go. The arrows, black arrows, show the transition areas where you go from one to the other. And the darkened area is the formal area, which is in the foreground. And then as you proceed down those avenues or the transition areas to the back, which would be the northern part, you get to the natural area, which we will look at here. Okay, there's one of those avenues that was put in, Oak Avenue. It kind of takes you straight toward the northern back of the cemetery. And there, when you get to the back of the cemetery, the roads are unpaved, and it looks very natural, like you're walking into the woods. And this was by design, and it appealed very much to a man named George Parker, who was a civil engineer, who would have been into the ideas that were behind the formulation of this type of cemetery. And he's buried on one of those back roads in there with his family. And also his son, Harold Parker. And there's the Parker family buried a little way up the road in the back. And the trees are all natural with the leaves falling at all seasons. You never see anybody go in there and rake them up because you're not supposed to. It's intentionally left natural. You go back to the dust and into the woods.
And a great collection of pink lady slippers.
Yes, don't you dare pick one. Okay, and with Harold Parker, just a word about another native son, or close to native. He lived in Lancaster. The son of George A. Parker, George Allenson Parker, has a state park or forest up in Middleton or North Andover, Massachusetts, named after him, because the Parkers were also people who believed in preserving forests. And there's a big, long little something about him and his devotion to forestry. And he was considered a very prominent engineer in his time, forestry engineer.
Parker's,
Hmm?
was he Connie's father?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, Harold Parker, he was the eldest son. That's not Herbert Parker. Herbert Parker was the judge. Okay, now here's another picture just to show you that the names of the streets suggest different things. He just didn't name them by accident. Number 6, Prospect. If the trees were all cut down, as they must have been down back in the day, you would get a beautiful view out that way. You can't see the view because the trees are in the way. But when he designed the cemetery, it was all open. Deep Dean. Okay, number 8, you're going down, down, down a hill. And he kind of borrowed that name from Olmsted, but it has to do with naming of a certain forest area as well. And same thing with number 11. Glen is another name for a forested area of a certain type. Number 12, Vista. Vista's on the outer periphery up at the top there. And from Vista, if it were all cleared down and you really had a vista, you'd get to see Mount Monadnock, which was quite a nice place, and why some people chose to be buried there on Vista, because their family could, you know, visit them and view the beautiful scene. And then the road's grown over. If you look on the left-hand side, you see 13. And in that area, that's where things got a little bit off track. Okay, so the plan got a little bit altered there. He wanted to have some roads called Chestnut Road, Dell Road, Beechdale Road. But sometime during the 1930s, the plan changed a bit, and the road configurations never were followed through. And instead, they put in some more straight-looking roads. I think there's one now called Ash. And it makes for easier burials, not family style necessarily, but stones one right after another. And so he wanted to put a hardwood dell, and the tree that would have been the favored tree for that dell was going to be the beech tree. And beech trees are gorgeous trees for New England. If you ever go to Rhode Island, to Newport, many of the mansions have those beech trees, and they have those knobby feet on the trees, and they grow to a tremendous height. Okay, Cleveland's final resting place, Lakewood Cemetery. He died in Hinsdale. His son had him buried in Minneapolis, and he had no marker on his grave. He died in 1900. There was no marker put there till 1948. And the people who did this, who was it, Karen? Who did them?
The St. Paul, Minneapolis, historical, or a church, St. Paul, Minneapolis.
They made sure he finally got a plaque.
Yeah, they made sure, and it was dedicated and everything, like you said, in 1948.
Yeah, so the pioneer landscape architect whose vision reaching beyond the times and lives of the rivers, parks, and Twin Cities, they are his true monument. Well, yeah, but not entirely. We have some too. Okay, an important force in 19th century American landscape architecture. He's long been overshadowed by none other than Frederick Law Olmsted. And if you say the name Olmsted, everybody's heard of Olmsted. You say the name Cleveland, who? Who?
Olmsted beat Cleveland out for the design of Central Park in New York.
Yeah, and he went out and had some jobs done in California. It's a little bit further reaching west than was Cleveland. But I think it seems time for his numerous accomplishments and contributions to be recognized here in Lancaster. So Cleveland's work has gotten the attention of many experts. These are the people. The one on the left is the one who gave us the box full of documents that Karen has been going through. And the one on the right-hand side, Dr. Nadenicek, I called on the phone, and he gave us a really good tip to get to a thesis that had been written by one of his students that really gave the good description of Eastwood Cemetery. So these men both agree that Cleveland didn't get his fair due share of attention for his work. And there's a beech tree. They're few and far between in Eastwood. Actually, if you go down to that area where he wanted the dell, there's a bunch of scrubby ones in there, but they're almost overpowered by the coniferous trees. You know, they're all squashed out. So this is soon to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. That whole process takes 2 years. I'd say our team that's working on it from the company in Rhode Island that's hired to do the job is about halfway through the project. And after they're done with their work, it has to go to DC for the National Park Service to approve it. And then he will get his fair credit. So in conclusion, the future of the Eastwood Cemetery, the person who wrote the dissertation suggested that it be connected to other walking spaces. And we do have other walking spaces in close proximity if you wanted to create a trail system, but we don't know. So we don't know what the future holds. We're hoping for the best. Maybe when people die, perhaps, if they want to have a tree planted in the memory of the person who's passed away, they could plant a beech tree in Eastwood and recreate that dell that never happened. One unfortunate thing is back where that dell area was, they made it into a dump. And the DPW has pushed stuff over the edge. And they're kind of covering up the dump now, but it's kind of unsightly. Okay, the end. Thank you so much for attending and for your support. And I went long, but that'll probably be the last one for a while. Yes.
I would just like to tell the people, I worked for 6 chair people on the historical commission before I retired. And Heather has taken projects that have been worked on for many years and got them completed. And I think we all owe her a big round of applause.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I like to get the job done.
The National Register will have all of Carrie's
Yeah.
fine building.
We'll have all 7.
Yeah.
And there's already 3 on and 4 to go. So with the batch of ones that are on the table working on now, it'll be 7. And then after that, we have many other projects here in Lancaster. A lifetime. And anyone who wants to help, come and join.
Yeah, and Heather, you have a wonderful support team around you.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yes. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Couldn't do it without you. Yeah, so, yeah.